If while her husband lives she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man. Therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law through the body of Christ, that you may marry to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to God. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit to death. But now we have been delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of the Spirit, not in the oldness of the letter. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity by the commandments, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, sin was dead. I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment, which was to bring life, I found to bring death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me. Therefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good.
What we have before us is the beginning of chapter 7. This is also the final week of our first quarter meeting together. This is lesson number 12, and we are carrying this out for the remainder of the next quarter. And you may be thinking, well, we're not even halfway through the book of Romans, and we've got we've got a whole nother quarter ahead of us. And the back end is a little bit easier than the front end. We're going to be spending a little bit more time in this front end than we would on the back end. Next week, we will not be here, or myself and my family will not be here, but Brother Don will be filling in for me next Sunday morning. Those questions for next Sunday morning are already at the back foyer. If you'll pick one of those up as you exit, we'll be looking at the second half of the second half of Romans chapter 7 next week. Now, let us remember where it is that we are in the context of the narrative, or in the context of this epistle. So far, we've looked at the salutation and theme, and then we evaluated where Paul lays at the feet of all of mankind, both Jew and Gentile, that they are held to the bondage of sin, that they are guilty of sin. But then we are justified by faith. And one of the key instances that we need to emphasize again this morning out of Romans chapter 4 is that we are not saved by perfect law keeping. If we tried to do such, then salvation would be what? Well, if we try, it is useless, because we cannot perfectly keep the law. But if we did perfectly keep the law, then salvation would be earned. It would be by works. It would be merited salvation. And the point that Paul makes in Romans chapter 4 is that's not the way salvation has ever worked, going all the way back to Father Abraham, the one who is the father of both Jew and Gentile, those who are circumcised and circumcised, because he was justified by faith. In Romans chapter 5, he emphasized to us that justification by faith, in that Christ has brought to us things that are greater and better than what Adam brought to the human race through his sin and rebellion against God. Well, then in chapter 6, we really begin to look at that transformed life. By the grace of God, we have been saved, and that new life then should be seen that we live differently than we once did. We think differently and we act differently. Everything has changed because we have been baptized into Christ. We have put him on in baptism. Therefore, we live in newness of life. But if you'll take note, in chapters 6 and 7, Paul seems to be answering the same objector. And again, it's not that he's already received a letter, but rather as he is going through the processes of writing this and thinking about, well, what is it that somebody could object? What is it that somebody could say in response? Well, at the end of chapter 5, wherever sin abounds, grace does more. Well, then the objector would say, well, if grace does more, then I need to do what? I need to sin more because the more I sin, the greater God's grace becomes. Well, God forbid, Romans chapter 6 in verse 1. Well, then in Romans chapter 6 and verse 15, Paul, you're saying that we're not under law, but we're under grace. Well, then if we're not under law, there's nothing to control us. We're just going to live however we want. And then in Romans chapter 6 and verse 15, there's the objection. Shall we sin because we are not under law, but under grace? Again, the answer is simple. What? Certainly not. May it never be. So there's another objection. In chapter 7 and verse 7, we have the third, and the question is the law sin? And we're going to be looking at that this morning. Is the law sin? Of course, may it never be. And then the final objection is there in verse 13 that we'll look at finally next week. Therefore did what was good become a cause of death for me? So Paul is answering all of these things, and it does seem that the primary context or the primary audience of these objections would have been the Jews, not the Gentiles. But at the same time, law, either it be the Torah and the law of Moses, or the law just in the law that man lives under, we are all under some form of law. That law is made to die through Christ. We die to that law and we are saved by God's grace. All right. Well, in chapter 6, in verse 15, Paul asks this question, and then he illustrates his answer in chapter 6 with what type of relationship? Looking particularly at verses 17 and 18. You were once what to sin? Slaves to sin, but now you are slaves to righteousness. So Paul first answers this question through this illustration. And again, this is a part of the difficulty of trying to maintain all of these thoughts as we journey week to week, and we have 6-7 days separating each Bible study. I have a hard time just trying to keep everything in the box of what Paul's saying. But when we think about being slaves of sin to now being slaves of righteousness, what has to be done for a slave to be given freedom? He has, Miss Marcia just said it, you have to be bought. You have to be redeemed. And that's exactly what Jesus has done for us. You think about the various passages in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 20. But you have been bought with a price. Therefore glorify God with your body. In verse 23 of chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, you were bought with a price. Well, what is the price that has purchased us? The blood of Christ. The blood of Christ has redeemed us. And we talked about that a little bit probably at the end of Romans chapter 5. In the purchasing that Jesus has made through his death, burial, and resurrection. You think about in Acts chapter 20 and verse 28 that he purchased with his own blood. So that's the first illustration that Paul uses in answering the question of verse 15 of chapter 6. But Paul uses a second illustration to also deal with that same question. And the second illustration is what we find there in those first 3 verses. So what do we learn from out of Romans 7 verses 1 through 3? All right, the old law has no dominion over us. Now, and this is where everything becomes a little difficult for me in my mind. I'm trying to think, well, you know, of course we think about Ephesians chapter 2. We think about Colossians chapter 2, that the law of decrees that were hostile toward us were canceled. We were nailed to the cross. But it's not necessarily that's the point of Paul saying here that the old law has died. But what does he say? We have died to that law in verse 4. And again, that's going to be the next question, so I don't want to step too far. But what do we learn? What's the illustration in Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 3? Brother David. I'm sorry, again? Yes. As long as you're living, you're under the jurisdiction of whatever that law is, whether it be the Torah or just universal law. Yes, sir.
It struck me while studying this lesson that Jesus used or Paul rather used the marriage relationship. As long as the husband lives, she's under that law, no divorce.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jesus had to die to take away the old law so that we could be married to the new law.
Absolutely. So now we're seeing, again, when Paul uses physical marriage, why does he use that? In Ephesians 5 and Romans 7, why does Paul use marriage between a husband and a wife? Because the church is the bride of Christ, and oftentimes we become then the feminine. We become the female in this portion of the play because that is what we are to our bridegroom, which is Christ. You know, if you go back to Genesis chapter 2, when God institutes marriage, do any one of us, as you read through Genesis chapter 2, begin to contemplate that God already has in his mind exactly what Paul's writing about even here? I mean, if you're just reading Genesis chapter 2 for the very first time, you're probably just going, okay, it's just it's a marriage, it's a vow between a husband or a male and a female, and it's a lifelong commitment, and it cannot be put asunder. There's no laws of man that can write it away. The only exception, now the exception clause is not given here. That's what we find in Matthew chapter 19, but the only exception is really death. That's the only way that it ends is death. When one dies, well then that individual, whether it be the husband or the wife, is then free then to marry someone else. So here Paul gives this illustration of marriage. Now, why, if this is the Jews that are in the context, why would the Jews be so hesitant to become married to Christ? Yes, Brother Ron. Okay. Well, and we see that especially in Matthew 19, and more of the context of that the Jews had really become just as guilty as we are in making a mockery of the institution of marriage. And, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? So yes, that could be an influence. What else? What had apparently the New Testament Jews learned from the Old Testament Jews? The Old Testament Jews what was the primary sin of Old Testament Israel before captivity? Spiritual adultery. And we see that throughout the Old Testament. Particularly, we see it throughout the prophets. In Jeremiah chapter 3, have you seen what faithless Israel did? And I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a writ of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she went as a harlot also. Ezekiel chapter 23, for they have committed adultery, and blood is on their hands. Thus they have committed adultery with their idols. Hosea chapter 1. Hosea is told by God to go and marry a woman of what? Harlotry. Why? Because Hosea becomes a literal manifestation of who? God. And God's relationship with his adulterous Israel. So all of these things throughout the Old Testament. So when we come to post-captivity, it seems like, especially when we look at the New Testament, the Jews never really had a problem with what anymore? Idolatry. They've kind of trumped that. They've grown above that. Now, are they sinless? Absolutely not. They're still in need of salvation. But yet, when Jesus comes on the scene and Jesus claims equality with God the Father, the Jews immediately hate him because of that, because what he then is required is worship. Just like they would worship the Father, so they are to worship the Son. And for them, in the Jewish mindset, that's what? That's blasphemy, and that's adultery. So they're still having to deal with this problem that here you're saying that we're going to be married to God. We're already married to God through the old law. But you're saying now that we're going to be married to Jesus. Well, we're being married to two different people. And Paul's saying, no, that's not the course at all. Now, in John chapter 8 and verse 41, I think the context there when the Jews respond to Jesus when he says, you are doing the deeds of your father, and they say to him, we are not born of fornication, we have one Father, God. I don't think that they're necessarily talking about the direct context of Romans 7. I think what they're saying to Jesus is, we were not born from an illegitimate mother. We're not an illegitimate son. I think they're pointing to the virginity of Mary there in John chapter 8. But still yet, I think that that's the problem that the Jews are having in that first century, is they cannot understand how am I, if I am married to God through the Torah, can I now be married to Christ as in the church? And they're struggling with this. And Paul's explanation in the illustration he gives is that a wife is eligible only as the husband lives. But if that has died, and if you have died to that husband, well, then you can be made alive to the new. And I think that's what Paul's teaching. All right. I know that's a long way around just to explain 3 verses. Brother Ron. Absolutely. So James chapter 4. James chapter 4, you adulteresses, do you not know that the enmity with the world, or friendship with the world, is the enmity with God? And that's exactly the point that James makes in James chapter 4, that we can be guilty of spiritual adultery ourselves. And that's one of the reasons we have to learn from Old Testament Israel, and we need to know those events so well. All right. Now, when we think about wife to a husband too, we ought to see a similarity, and I'm being very cautious in my words here because I don't want you to misconstrue me or misunderstand me. But in the first illustration, you have slave to master. It is something in which you submit to. You're either going to submit to sin or you're going to submit to Jesus as your Lord and Master. It's the same relationship with wife to husband, just in the sense of you submit to your husband, and we are called to submit to the lordship of Jesus. And that's a similarity between, and that's how Paul answers this question in 2 different ways. Well, how did we die to the law which held us captive? Through Christ, through the blood of Christ. So again, I think the point of verse 4 is he's saying to us, it is not that the law it's still here, but now we have been made alive through the body of Christ. Paul's already answered that for us really back in chapter 6 and verses 3 and 4. Jesus died, he was buried, and he was resurrected. And so are we when we are baptized into Christ. We have died to sin, and we are resurrected to that new man. We are no longer to live by the law. We are no longer to live by sin, but rather by the grace of God. Any other comments, questions there? I ask these questions, and sometimes these questions are difficult for me, and I'm just like, what was I asking? You know, you just got to live with a 40-year-old brain sometimes. In what way were sinful passions aroused by the law and at work in our members to bear fruit for death? All right, so there's something that just, you know, when you tell a child, don't touch, it's what? And what does that child do? It wasn't that hot. Yeah, I mean, John McCants laughs because we know. All right, Brother Frank.
Verse 8 speaks to that. Sin taking opportunity by the commandment to produce in me all manner of evil desire.
Absolutely. All manner, and really you could, I mean, you take out, in verse 21 of this same chapter, Paul really uses as a synonym for sin, instead of saying sin, he says, for I find then that the principle of evil is present in me. And that's really, those are two synonymous words. And you could use either of those words in the context here. Now, I really enjoyed one of the things that Mr. Bird said in his literal or his translation, or trying to give to us an updated, what does this look like or what does it mean? Listen to verse 5 from his applicational translation. He says, while we were living out our fleshly fetishes, our anti-God and anti-creation desires, evoked as they were by the Jewish law, those things that are at work in our bodily members to produce fruit leading to the harvest of death. And you're thinking, whew, that's more convoluted and more difficult than just the basic verse 5 of chapter 7. But what I really enjoyed is our anti-God and anti-creation. We have to realize that when we sin against God, what we're doing first and foremost is we're replacing Him on the throne of our hearts. We're saying, God, you are not the supreme authority for my life, I am. That's the anti-God part. The anti-creation is that we're saying to God, whatever it is that you've done and whatever boundaries you've established, they are not sufficient enough, and that's not what I want for myself. Therefore, I'm going to do my own thing. And we are then telling the Creator, you messed up. Again, it's a complete shifting of blame that really occurs when we sin. Now, something another thing that Mr. Bird revealed or helped me understand is that if you look at verse 5, really verse 5 is what Paul's going to take the rest of chapter 7 to explain, specifically in verses 14 through 25. That whole section of 14 through 23 where Paul is personifying himself as one who is struggling. I know what is good and I want to do it, but I do that which is evil. I do that which I hate. And that struggle, that conflict of nature that is occurring in verses 14 through 23, that's really what Paul is introduced to us in verse 5. When he says to us, for while we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which are aroused by that law were at work in the members of our body to bring forth the fruit of death. Paul's going to lengthen his explanation of that in verses 14 through 23. But then how beautiful it is in verse 6, Paul says to us that we have now been released from the law, having died to it. That goes back to the earlier portions, that we have died to that law through Christ, by which we were bound, so that we serve in the newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. That's Romans chapter 8, verses 1 through 17. So verse 5 is going to be further explained to us in verses 14 through 23. And verse 6 is going to be further explained to us in chapter 8, verses 1 through 17. And seeing all of these connections, because something that Paul really begins to emphasize at this section of Romans is the idea of flesh and the idea of spirit. And you will either live according to one of those things, and I'll leave some of those things for next week. I don't want to spend too much there. One last observation in verse 6. We serve in the newness of spirit, not in the oldness of the letter. Where's another place that Paul kind of talks about the old versus the new in similar language? Go with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Beginning at verse 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, beginning at verse 6. Who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. But if the ministry of death and letters engraved on stones came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because of the glory of his face fading as it was, how will the ministry of the Spirit fail to be even more with glory? For if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. And I think Paul's talking about a very similar idea there in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 as he talks about here in Romans chapter 7. In that we need to take note that Paul never speaks of the law in a negative sense. Why? Why would Paul not speak negatively about the law that brings forth death through sin with no hope of salvation? Why would you not speak about that with a negative sense? Because it was God's law. When David had the opportunity to kill Saul not just once, but twice, he did not take his life either time. Why? Because he was God's anointed. Even though he was a negative influence in David's life, even though he didn't help David at all, it really hindered David, he still recognized God's stamp upon him as an individual. And I think you see that same in a greater sense in Paul's respect to the old law. He doesn't speak of it negatively. He knows and recognizes it as God's stamp. And it's just man's failure to apply it properly is what's happening. All right. Well, let's continue to move. Why would anyone suppose that the law is sin? This brings us to that third question that Paul has to answer. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Okay.
I mean, look, if I'm going down 65, driving up to Nashville, 70 miles an hour really just doesn't seem fast enough. And so that law is horrible.
Mm-hmm. Well, and how easy it is for us to see that and to disregard it and to ignore it, but yet when we trespass, what must we take into calculation? If the blue lights come on behind us, we got a $250 speeding ticket coming our way. I don't know how much they are. I'm not saying that I know. The last one I paid was from the wonderful city of St. Florine, because y'all know that was a wonderful speed trap for so long. And that's the point. And I mean, we go all the way back to Romans 3 and verse 20. You go all the way back to Romans 3 and verse 20. Paul makes this point there. And that is, because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin, and with the knowledge of sin comes forth death. And when we see this, and Paul's making this, well then, the Jew is going to say, well, if grace abounds, we should say, well, okay. Well, then the law is the source of, no, it's not the law, it's sin. Well, then the law is sin because it makes sin knowledge. And Paul says, no, it's not the law that has done the wrong. It is man in his application.
John chapter 1, 100%.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Who were born by the will of God, not the will of man, will of the flesh, and all those various other things.
Ignorance is bliss.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely. So sin or the law then becomes the perpetrator, not myself. So we think about this in the midst of these verses. There, Paul talks about, in verse 9, I was once alive apart from the law. What's Paul talking about here? Genesis chapter 2 and verse 25. And they were both naked and what? Unashamed. Were they alive? Spiritually, physically, all the above. They were perfect in Genesis 2 and verse 25. But as soon as sin enters the equation, what also comes into the equation? Spiritual death, shame, the consequences of that sin. Those who are alive in Genesis 2 and verse 25 by Genesis 3 and verse 7 are dead. And I think what Paul's saying there in verse 9 is, if we really wanted to take this to its logical conclusion, is man born totally depraved? No, because if he was born totally depraved, could you ever be alive apart from the law? No. But there is some point in each one of our lives, and this is one reason I've tentatively tried to change my vocabulary. Instead of saying age of accountability, I try to say mind of accountability. Because mind is the issue. It is when that person understands, looking at verse 9, when the commandment came, then what happened? Sin became alive and I died. When I acknowledge God's law at some point in my life, and I know age and mind really are it's just arguing of semantics. But at some point in my life, I made the acknowledged dissent that I am not going to do what God wants me to do. I'm going to do what I want to do. And at that point in time, I die to sin. And I die to God. All right. So I think that's also something that's happening here.
It just doesn't work. They'll pass a new law. Up to that point, that was not a violation. But after that point, it is a violation. And that's the way I think Paul is talking about here, is when people realize what is wrong, therefore it's wrong. Before that time, they were not accountable, like you should say. And as much as a child comes up, they don't know these things, do you teach them these things? Then, after they're taught, they should know these things, avoid those, and don't commit a sin.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Brother Ron.
Just yesterday, I was sitting at an intersection and trying to make a left turn and wait for my green light, and I got a green light, and I get this flow of traffic coming from the right. I thought, what's the matter with these people? Is there something wrong with the light? And the guy in the next vehicle, he saw my impatience, and I rolled down my window, and he says, sir, this is a funeral procession. So now I know the law, I know what's going on here.
It's a little bit different.
We don't get that.
I was about to say, that's probably the difference between being from California versus Lauderdale County, where we still have the funeral procession. Because it's thrown me off a couple of times too. I'm like, what in the world's happening here? Well, when we think about, the purpose of the law, and this ties into what is covetousness. What is the purpose of the law is what? I have hid your word in that I might not sin against you. The purpose of the law is to what? It's to be a safeguard from sin. But at the same time, when we know the law and acknowledge that law, what takes advantage of the law? Sin does. And that's two. What is it here where it makes it all the more sinful? Or maybe a little bit later. All right, so what is covetousness? Yes.
But not always. Sin pointed out that. Law pointed out that sin.
All right.
Oh, what you got, you have to give your fuzzy boy.
All right. So covetousness is one of those, I put it this way, it's the unspoken failure. Would y'all agree with that assessment? The unspoken sin, the unspoken failure. When's the last time withdrawn from or it confessed it? Because at this, we don't want everyone else to know that we're covetous. What is covetousness? And then the desire to take it and to make it mine. One of the footnotes in the New American Standard at one of these junctures for the word covet is another possible interpretation is lust. And what's interesting is in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 27, for a man who looks upon a woman and what? And lust after her. The real literal translation should be covets her.
The word desire is the definition. If you go back to the Greek word, it makes it, it's a desire to have more.
All right.
And what taking covet, desire to have what's not yours.
All right. So take more to have what is not yours. We don't know any stories about that in the Old Testament, do we? Naboth's vineyard, what did Ahab want? And what did Jezebel deliver? Bathsheba, what did David want? And what did what was delivered? We have to know these things and put these things into application. No, my sin may not be Bathsheba. My sin may not be Naboth's vineyard. But somewhere down the line, I have that weakness if I'm not careful and guarding, and I have that same, just that desire to have that which is not mine, and if I'm not careful, it can take me from what God would want me to have.
You know, in all these arguments, Paul continues to point out the nagging.
Absolutely.
I noticed 5 things here, verses 10 through 14. The law brings life, the law is holy, the law is just, the law is good, and the law is spiritual.
Absolutely. And especially verse 12 as that conclusion of, you remember, we go all the way back to verse 15 of chapter 6. Shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? Paul is not demeaning the law. He's building it up. But very quickly, I want to spend our last few moments together this morning talking about sin and the various ways in which Paul describes it in this section. What are some things that y'all caught as you journey through this section in the way Paul describes sin? All right, it can dwell in you. Yes, ma'am. Evil desire.
Deception.
It's deceptive. Verse 9, sin became alive. Sin is not a dormant feeling. Sin is not some dead thing lying on the side of the road that we drive by and go, "Oh, that was nasty." Sin is alive. In the way in which Paul really describes sin in this section, and he does it throughout the next 2, and at the end of chapter 7, Brother Ron, I'll come to you in just a second, is he really describes sin as a living beast seeking to devour its prey. Do we see that any other place? 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, right? All right, Brother Ron.
It usually doesn't display it unless we don't want to understand it.
Absolutely. So sin only corrupts and destroys. The thief came in to steal, kill, and destroy. John 10 and verse 10, but the latter end, but the Son of Man came to give life and to give it abundantly. When you think about what Paul says there, for sin taking an opportunity through the commandment, verse 11. Sin taking an opportunity through the commandment. What was the commandment in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 17? You shall not what? Eat of the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden. And how did the serpent tempt Eve? He adds one little word, but he takes the commandment and he deceives with it. He took the commandment and he deceived, and because he did such, it becomes alive, and then sin taking that opportunity deceives me, and through it kills me. And we ought to see temptation and sin as a gruesome murder, because that's what it is doing. But still yet, we oftentimes, if we're not careful, we want to view sin as just like a little paper cut. It stings for a little while, but ultimately it goes away quickly. Sin is not just a little paper cut. Sin is truly our hearts being ripped out of our chest and being thrown out to the floor. It is a gruesome thing that we ought to see when sin is trying to tempt us. Absolutely. Well, one writer said this. He said, my record under law is Adam's record. Like Adam and Eve, I was once alive. I had not presented myself as a slave to sin, but the time came when I fully transgressed the law. Sin came alive and I died. Once I had traveled that forbidden pathway, law is of no redemptive help. Even though I have a desire to do what is right, death dominatingly reigns over me. And that's really the situation that we need to see ourselves in. So I hate to leave you with the doom and gloom, but that's really where you need to be left until next week, because it's only going to get a little bit worse. But what always comes in the morning? Salvation always comes in the morning. And I think that is an impressive thought and a theme in the Old Testament. And it's one of those themes that I've recently saw in other studies. All right, finally, any other comments, questions, observations in this first section of Romans chapter 7? I very much appreciate your kind participation and discussion in the study this morning.